people tend to think of as melatonin. We have a very clear understanding of the role that melatonin plays physiologically with the reduction of light. What about the use of supplemental melatonin? It seems that the doses are quite large relative to what we would physiologically produce. Of course, I don't really know the implication of that because what the brain produces doesn't necessarily have an easy parallel for how much you would ingest orally, and God knows how much is bioavailable, et cetera. But typically the lowest dose of melatonin you can find is about 300 micrograms, and they go up to 3 milligrams.
Or some actually 5 and 10 milligrams.
Oh, wow. I've never seen something that high. So you can go up to from 300 to 10,000 micrograms of melatonin. Talk to us a little bit about your feelings overall on the physiologic relevance of these doses, the length of time one should use this, the impact it may have on the downregulation of melatonin receptors. What is your overall thought on the use of melatonin, exogenous melatonin?
So I think the first thing to say is that melatonin, typically if you're using it, can help the timing of your sleep, but doesn't necessarily change the quantity and the quality of that sleep. Although the more I've been reading a little bit more about the sort of the receptor dynamics, I'm taking a step back. I think it may actually have a potential benefit for deep non-REM sleep that I'll come back to. Melatonin seems to be efficacious under at least 2 conditions, and I think there's a third pending. The first is when you're jet lagged and you're traveling, the melatonin can be immensely useful to help re-entrain your sleep rhythm. And usually there you take it sort of about 45 minutes to an hour before bed. And I'll come back to the dose as you described in a second. The second is in people who are typically over the age of 50. And the reason is because the older that we get, the blunter our circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm, which is your 24-hour rhythm, has a wonderful high peak during the day. You're active and alert, and then it scales down at night, and that's when we sleep. And it's up and it's down, it's up and it's down. The older that we get, the flatter that sinusoidal sort of rhythm becomes. So you get less deep valleys and you get less high peaks, as it were. And what melatonin can do, supplementation in older adults, is help increase the valley, as it were, as you drop down at night, and it will try to get you into that deeper sleep. And that's why older adults will typically say, I often don't feel like I have the energy. I feel a little bit fatigued and tired during the day, but then I don't sleep as well at night. And the reason is because they don't have this, think of it like an on-off switch. You want to be on during the day with wake, you want to be off at night during sleep. And to do that, you have to have a nice, powerful rise and lull in your circadian rhythm. The flatter that rise and the lull, the less on you are during the day and the less off you are at night. So it's almost like a dimmer switch that starts to get stuck in the middle, and it's just kind of flip-flopping back and forth a little bit. So that's where supplementation can be useful in people who are older with melatonin. That's where we see some benefit too. So those two circumstances, jet lag, older adults, they seem to benefit from melatonin and the use of melatonin for sleep-wake rhythm regulation. The third, which is kind of like this caveat right now, I think is, as a nation, as we've described, we're increasingly bathed in artificial light at night, preventing that darkness signal from telling our brain it's time to sleep. And if you look at the studies that were done back in healthy adults where they said, you know what, melatonin doesn't really seem to have much of a benefit in people who are healthy and non-jet lagged. I think those studies were done at a time probably in the early 2000s or late 1990s where we were less impacted by especially this light at night and especially blue LED light because those lights just weren't around at that time. So I think the relevance of melatonin as we're moving sort of into this more technology-dominated era of blue light may become more relevant. So those three scenarios, I think, could be where melatonin is efficacious. The reason I think that it may actually also have a sleep benefit is, as I've been reading it, and we're starting to try and play around with this too in the sleep center, melatonin may be hypothermic, that it may have a component of it that regulates your core body temperature, and melatonin may help drop your core body temperature because of that sort of hypothermic benefit. And that's where I think the unknown advantages of melatonin on sleep may be found. It's not just a sleep timing aid, it could also be a sleep depth aid. We just don't know that yet. The two caveats that I would put onto melatonin, however, and you should think about this if you're going to use it, the first is dose. As you mentioned, some people are dosing too high. They're using 5 or even 10 milligrams. There is some, not strong evidence, but there's some evidence out there that if you use too high a dose, you may actually shut down your body's own production of natural melatonin, and you don't want to do that. I mean, you see this with testosterone, for example. If you start to use testosterone supplementation for too long or too high, the body may actually start to shut down its own production. That could be also true. I don't think there's enough.
It's so interesting because there are some hormones, as you said, for which that is absolutely true, and testosterone is the poster child. Conversely, thyroid hormone, right? You could be on the highest dose of exogenous T4 for years and years and years, such that your TSH falls to 0. But yet, when you stop taking that thyroid hormone, the pituitary gland picks right back up. So very interesting how, I've always wondered why some hormones do this and some don't.
Yeah, and those feedback systems of ultimate shit. So I think there's a possibility with melatonin. There's some evidence to say that you need to be careful. I would start with a minimum dose. I'd probably start with about 0.5 milligrams and think about cutting it off up to 3 milligrams. I'd probably be reticent to go much more than that. So that's the first caveat with melatonin. The second caveat is that it's not FDA regulated, which means that it's a bit of a wild west. And there was a study out there that looked at probably somewhere between 15 or 20 different vendors of over-the-counter melatonin. And the first thing that they found is that based on what was stated on the bottle relative to what was actually in those pills when they tested them, it ranged from being about 80% less than what was stated on the bottle to 470% more than what was stated on the bottle, and everything in between. So you have to understand that it's unclear how actually homologous what it says on the bottle is relative to what you're swallowing.
Are there brands that you have found that you like? I've talked a lot in the past about, in general, supplements. I tend to prefer a brand called Jarrow because back when I had access to it, I had done some testing of their supplements and they just seem to be the cleanest, the best of the best. And they're more expensive for what it's worth. But in the same thing, like with EPA and DHA, I've tended to favor either Nordic Naturals or Carlson's because they just have a higher quality product. They have the fewest contaminants, et cetera. When it comes to melatonin, do you have a brand that you see as being much closer to what you expect based on the bottle?
I don't, in truth. And if I did, I would be very sort of public about it. I think one of the problems with that paper is that they actually didn't publish the names of the other companies, which is understandable.
Do you remember what year that paper was?
We can put it in the show notes. I'll send it over to you and people can take a look. The second thing, if you read that paper in detail, and it's a great paper.
Because we should just contact the authors.
And see if you can.
Yeah, we're not interested in sort of crapping on the bad guys, but I want to know who the good guys are.
Right. And the good guys, you can imagine, are defined by 2 parameters. And this was the second finding of the paper. Firstly, from one brand to the next, huge variability. Unfortunately, within one brand, from one batch to the next, you also had variability, almost as much variability as between brands as well. So I think that that's the tricky part when it comes to melatonin. And I think unless you're getting FDA grade, it's a bit of a crapshoot when it comes to melatonin. But I think I do still feel there is hope in melatonin. I think the fact that a lot of people seem to use it and gain some benefit suggests that it probably is efficacious to a degree. But let's just keep in mind something that we spoke about before, which is the placebo effect, which is one of the most consistent effects that we see in much of medicine and certainly pharmacology. So there's that to keep in mind too. And in as much as the dangers that we've just spoken about regarding shutting down the body's own release of melatonin and the concentration variability, if you can put those to the side, then the placebo effect, no harm, no foul there.
Well, thank you, Orrin Hatch, for the supplement industry. We owe you a debt of gratitude, and I hope you can hear the sarcasm in my voice. I think most people now are wise to it, and we certainly spoke about it at length in the original episodes about the real downside of things like Ambien, Lunesta, these drugs.